Oberyn Martell stood inside the Red Keep's courtyard, sweat sliding down his temples as the sun began its slow descent into the horizon. The crowd was on edge, their every heartbeat seeming to echo through the thick air. Tyrion Lannister, accused of regicide, stood to one side, flanked by nervous guards. In the center of it all, the mountain stood. Gregor Clegane, a hulking figure in dented armor, blood seeping from an open wound in his side where Oberyn's spear had found its mark. The onlookers could scarcely breathe. The aroma of dust and the tang of fear permeated everything in the late afternoon glow. Oberyn's face was set in a grin that belied the seriousness of the situation. He raised the tip of his spear in a silent challenge, voice unwavering as he spoke. "You murdered her," he said, not for the first time. "You raped her. You killed her children." His words carried across the courtyard, though they were meant for the mountain alone. Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, had been dancing around his massive opponent for some time now. He was nimble, quick on his feet, but arrogance was creeping into his mind. Or perhaps it was simply confidence that he would vanquish this monster. Finally, on behalf of his sister Elia, Gregor Clegane rumbled a response, half roar, half grunt. Swiping with his long sword in a wide, brutal arc, Oberyn stepped just out of reach, dust swirling around his sandals. He circled again. "Say it," he demanded. "Say her name. Elia Martell of Dorne. You killed her. Who gave you the order?" The crowd watched, hearts hammering. Tyrion's expression was taut with a mixture of hope and dread. At the dais, Tywin Lannister sat observing with a stony face. Prince Oberyn read the truth in that face. Tywin wanted silence. The longer Gregor refused to speak, the safer Tywin remained. Oberyn feinted, pivoted on one foot, and drove his spear deep into Clegane's thigh. The mountain let out a roar that shook onlookers to their core. Still, Oberyn pressed him, wanting him to confess. A wave of hush fell over the courtyard as the mountain staggered back. He was close to collapse, or so Oberyn believed. The spear in Oberyn's hand trembled with the force of Clegane's shifting weight. Gregor's knees buckled for a moment. Oberyn took one fateful step closer, poised for a final thrust. He opened his mouth to speak, rage bright in his eyes. Then Gregor Clegane lunged, a huge, desperate swing of his arm that sent Oberyn reeling. The crowd gasped. This was the moment they'd feared. But Oberyn, though caught off guard, did not let his spear go. Instead, his reflexes took over, instincts sharpened by a lifetime of training. He bent low, barely avoiding the mountain's outstretched gauntlet. Gregor's hand grazed Oberyn's tunic, fingers snagging the light fabric. With an oath in his throat, Oberyn twisted, letting the fabric tear. As he spun aside, the move gave him just enough distance to bring the butt of his spear crashing into the mountain's helmet. Gregor's head snapped to the side. He stumbled, arms flailing for balance. In the swirl of dust, Oberyn's boots found purchase on the blood-slick stones. He raised his spear, seizing the advantage. The adrenaline in his veins whispered, "Finish him now," and so he did. With a fierce cry, he drove the spear toward the mountain's chest. Gregor Clegane tried to ward off the blow, but the jagged tip found a gap beneath his breastplate. Oberyn shoved with all his might, teeth bared in a snarl of triumph. The mountain staggered backward, sinking to one knee, choking on blood. Oberyn took a step forward, leaning in to watch Gregor's eyes dull with pain. He kicked the mountain's sword aside, then repeated, quietly but with unrelenting fury, "Who gave the order?" His voice was for Gregor's ears alone now. The mountain let out a ragged whisper. Oberyn leaned closer, heart pounding. Gregor, spitting blood, spoke a name. It was not the entire story, just one word, but it confirmed everything Oberyn had long suspected. "Tywin," Gregor coughed, red spittle coating his lips. "Tywin Lannister." A hush rippled through the gathered spectators as they saw the mountain's head loll. He sagged sideways, the spear embedded too deep to be easily removed. Oberyn hesitated, breath coming in heavy bursts, glancing up at the dais where Tywin Lannister stood. Tyrion's eyes were wide, heart visibly pounding in his chest. Prince Oberyn pulled in a long breath. It was not enough to just kill the mountain. He wanted the world to know the truth. Yet that single word from Gregor's dying mouth traveled through the courtyard like a ghostly wind. Some heard it, some questioned it. But enough had. Oberyn stepped away from the corpse, muscles quivering. He had done it, he had survived. His gaze cut to Tyrion, who watched in disbelief. There would be no summary execution for Tyrion this day, for Oberyn had championed him successfully. But the implications were much larger. There, at the top of the dais, Tywin Lannister rose from his seat. If the Lord of Casterly Rock felt any shock, it was concealed behind his stern exterior. Yet something in the line of Tywin's mouth, in the tension around his eyes, told Oberyn he had struck a nerve. Blood pounded in Oberyn's ears. He was not fool enough to openly accuse Tywin of murdering Elia Martell, at least not at that precise second. Not when the Lannisters still held the throne and King's Landing in an iron grip. But the die was cast. Dorne's vengeance was in motion. Oberyn's survival, his victory, changed everything. Dwarfing the uneasy crowd, the Red Keep towered over them, silent walls painted by the glow of a descending sun. Tyrion Lannister was declared innocent. The onlookers began to file out, hushed in their exodus, each bearing witness to the historic event. The mountain had confessed, if only in a dying whisper, but it was enough to leave a dark question lingering in the air. Oberyn could practically feel the stares of the Lannister soldiers on his back. He thought of Elia, of her children, of the years Dorne had waited. A part of him trembled with a fierce, exultant flame. At last, perhaps, the moment of retribution had begun. That evening, the sun burned the horizon a vivid orange before extinguishing into darkness. Oberyn retired to his quarters within the Red Keep, but rest was the last thing on his mind. Tendrils of weariness pulled at him, but the shock of adrenaline still lingered in his limbs. He slumped on a bench by the window, arms crossed, staring at the sprawling city below. King's Landing, stinking and labyrinthine, glowed in the flicker of thousands of torches. The hush of the day's end was broken occasionally by the distant sound of a city that never truly slept. A timid knock interrupted his thoughts. Ilaria Sand slipped inside, her eyes anxious. She saw him and, without speaking, pressed a soft hand to his cheek. She scanned his body for wounds, then let out a small breath of relief. "You won," she whispered. "But I feared. You were nearly—" She closed her eyes, as though trying to banish the image of Gregor's massive hand seizing Oberyn a moment before. Oberyn gave her a lopsided grin. "I am too stubborn to die," he murmured, leaning to kiss her forehead. "Besides, I had a promise to keep." He fell silent then, expression darkening. Gregor gave Tywin's name before he died. Her eyes widened. The truth, he confessed. Yes, and there were ears to hear it. Oberyn let out a weary sigh. Now it will be a matter of survival. Tywin will move. He'll want to discredit me or claim the words were those of a delirious dying man. But I think he is cunning enough to realize the realm will talk. They'll wonder if it's true, and I will not let it be dismissed. Ilaria squeezed his hand. "We must return to Dorne. Prince Dorne will know what to do." Oberyn nodded, yet he was hesitant. "We will go," he agreed. "But not quite yet. I need to secure Tyrion's release, and I need more than a rumor. I want enough proof to ensure there can be no question about Tywin's guilt." Ilaria's fingers trembled slightly around his. "You will be in danger. The Lannisters will not allow you to leave King's Landing peacefully, not if they suspect you'll raise Dorne against them." Oberyn pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "They might suspect it, but I am still a prince of Dorne. And unless they want open war with my brother, they must tread carefully." His dark eyes flickered with a dangerous light. "Of course, open war may well be upon us anyway." He rose from the bench, walking to the window. A breeze ruffled his sweat-stained hair. "It's time Dorne ceased its patient waiting and claimed the justice we've been denied for so long." Ilaria joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you'll be at the forefront of it." "Yes," A faint smile touched Oberyn's lips. Now that the world has seen what happens when a Martell thirsts for vengeance, I doubt Tywin will sleep easily. All through that night, Oberyn composed letters in his head, words he would send to Sunspear. He pictured his brother, the cautious Dorne Martell, reading the lines, eyes scanning each detail about the mountain's final confession. Dorne always favored patience, subtlety, and cunning, but perhaps this triumph and the open door to avenge Elia would spur the Prince of Dorne into a bolder path. By the time dawn light seeped over the walls of King's Landing, Oberyn had not truly slept. When a servant arrived to bring fresh water and food, Oberyn was already preparing for the day. His body ached from the brutal duel. Bruises were painted across his ribs, and his muscles screamed in protest. But he refused to show weakness. With Illyria's help, he dressed in a fine tunic that bore the sun and spear sigil of House Martell. When he emerged from his chambers, the corridor was strangely quiet. He made his way to a small council of sorts, though Tywin Lannister had not summoned him. Tyrion Lannister was there, newly freed, perched at the end of a table, face pinched with exhaustion. Varys watched from a shadowy corner, his expression unreadable. Even Jaime Lannister stood a short distance from Tyrion, arms folded, the tension between the brothers palpable. Tyrion looked up as Oberyn entered. "My champion," he said, managing a wry smile. "I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude, and perhaps my life." Oberyn gave a short, half-bow. "We both wanted the mountain to answer for his crimes. You are free now, though you will never be free from the Lannister's shadow." He eyed Jaime. "Has the king's hand seen you yet?" Tyrion's lips twisted. "No. Father is preoccupied." Oberyn raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I suspect he is." Silence descended. Varys cleared his throat, that soft, oily sound that made Oberyn's hackles rise. "It is fortunate for all that the trial by combat concluded in accordance with the law. Tyrion is free, and the crown's justice has been served." "Yes," Jaime said, though his voice was tinged with reluctance. "Brother, you should leave King's Landing. There will be repercussions, I'm sure, whether from father or Cersei. You're not safe here." Tyrion cocked his head, eyes flicking from Jaime to Oberyn. "And where, dear brother, should I go?" "To Casterly Rock." He gave a humorless laugh. "I can hardly imagine being welcomed with open arms." Jaime said nothing. Oberyn studied the two men. Tyrion, though sardonic, had an earnestness beneath the cynicism. Jaime, for all his golden hair and arrogance, seemed subdued. They stood in the small council chamber like figures in a silent play, each uncertain of the next move. Oberyn finally broke the hush. "I will return to Dorne soon, but I am not leaving just yet. I intend to collect more information about Tywin's role in my sister's murder. Whether I succeed or not, I promise you, Tyrion, that if you find yourself in need of refuge, I can provide it. Dorne honors its debts of friendship." Tyrion inclined his head, surprising gratitude in his eyes. "If it comes to that, I shall remember your offer." Varys shifted, hands folded in the sleeves of his robes. "Prince Oberyn, you are a most intriguing man. Should you require certain whisperings, perhaps I can be of service, for the right exchange." Oberyn gave the spymaster a narrow look. "I'll keep that in mind, Lord Varys." And so the day unfurled. Word spread about Gregor Clegane's final confession. People debated whether to believe it. The Lannisters' loyalists called it the delirium of a dying brute. But those who despised the Lannisters, and there were many, found cause to whisper that Tywin was a butcher, no more righteous than any back-alley cutthroat. Oberyn watched from the shadows, analyzing how the tides of rumor flowed through King's Landing. He received a summons from Prince Doran, brought by a raven that same afternoon. The letter read in Doran's measured tone, "Return swiftly and speak your truths. Bring a retinue. We must talk of justice and war." It did not name Tywin Lannister, nor speak openly of vengeance, but Oberyn knew the subtext. His brother was prepared to escalate. Elia Martell's memory had not dimmed one whit in Doran's cautious heart. If the crown's highest seat was behind her murder, Dorne would not sit idle. Ellaria read the letter over Oberyn's shoulder, resting her chin against him. "He knows," she murmured. "All these years, he has waited for a moment such as this." Oberyn let the letter fall to the table. "And now it has arrived." They left King's Landing under the pretense of returning to Dorne for a scheduled departure. No more reason to linger in the city, as the trial had ended. Tywin Lannister did not try to stop them, but Oberyn sensed the tension in the air. The Lannisters' men glared at them from behind helms. Cersei was nowhere to be seen, but rumor said she was enraged, not only at Tyrion's release but at Oberyn for winning the duel that should have ended differently. Just outside the city gates, Oberyn took a last, long look at the red walls and sword spires of the capital. A salt-laden breeze from Blackwater Bay brushed his face. In the distance, ships bobbed in the harbor, the mouth of the river glinting under the midday sun. War was coming, he felt sure, and part of him thrilled at the prospect. Dorne had chafed under the Targaryen conquest centuries before, yet they had retained more independence than any other region. The Martells were not a house to be trifled with. He mounted his horse, the saddle squeaking beneath him, and turned to Ellaria, who was already astride her mare. Together, they led a small procession southward, away from King's Landing and toward the Prince's Pass. Behind them trailed a few men-at-arms, loyal to House Martell, and a half-dozen of Oberyn's daughters, the Sand Snakes, each with their own fierce prowess. The road dust kicked up around their horses' hooves. There was no hurry, but there was urgency in Oberyn's heart. He suspected Tywin's watchers followed discreetly, but he did not fear an ambush. Not yet. Even Tywin Lannister would think twice before attacking a Martell retinue on the open road, risking immediate war with Dorne. Each day as they traveled deeper south, the air grew hotter, the soil drier, and Oberyn felt a sense of returning strength. This was home. The stony passes, the lonely deserts, the bright sun. They were the cradle of his youth and the crucible of his adulthood. They reached Sunspear well before the next full moon. The seat of House Martell rose from the dunes and the sea, a mix of sandstone towers and bright banners snapping in the wind. Oberyn's heart pounded with anticipation as he passed through the gates. Doran Martell waited for him in the Hall of Pillars. The older prince, robed in orange and gold, sat in a high-backed chair. His face, lined with both age and worry, broke into a measured smile at the sight of his younger brother. Beside him stood Arianne Martell, Doran's daughter and heir, her dark eyes alive with curiosity and tension. The hall was quiet but for the echo of footsteps as Oberyn approached the dais. "Brother," Doran said softly, inclining his head. A servant helped him rise from the chair. Doran's gout pained him more of late. "You have returned safely." "I have, and I bring news." Oberyn clasped Doran's hands, noting how fragile his brother felt. Yet he saw the iron in Doran's gaze. "Gregor Clegane is dead, and he named Tywin Lannister as the man who ordered Elaya's murder. Hundreds witnessed my victory, and many heard his final words." Arianne sucked in a breath. "The lion at last stands accused." Ellaria, who had followed close behind Oberyn, dipped her head in respect before speaking. "We must move swiftly, Prince Doran. The truth cannot be allowed to fade beneath Lannister gold. They will bribe or threaten, do anything to deny the confession." Doran's voice, while quiet, carried a certain determination. "Agreed. We have waited years for justice. Now that we have it, I will not let it slip through my fingers." He sank back into his seat, his expression pensive. "But we must not be rash. We must gather allies. The Tyrells hold influence in King's Landing, yet they despise the Lannisters. The North is in turmoil, but we might find potential friends among the scattered forces loyal to Robb Stark's memory. The Vale remains withdrawn, yet Littlefinger's influence there is uncertain. We must weave a delicate tapestry. Oberyn. War alone is a blunt instrument." Oberyn let out a breath. "Perhaps, but the time for caution has passed, brother. Elaya's name was declared in the capital itself. The Lannisters can pretend it never happened, but we will not." If we do not act with some measure of force, we risk losing the momentum." Doran's gaze flicked to Aryan, who nodded in understanding. Then he addressed Oberyn. "What do you propose?" Oberyn felt the weight of many eyes on him. Aryan's, Illyria's, the sand snakes, and the gathered court. He had only just arrived, but he knew in his bones that this was the moment. "I propose we mass our forces at the Prince's Pass and the Boneway. We let Tywin Lannister know, in no uncertain terms, that if he denies justice, we will bring war. We can coordinate with House Tyrell, perhaps. They have long chafed at the Lannisters' arrogance. If we march north, we can cut through the Stormlands or along the coast, forcing the Crown to face a second wave of conflict while they are still reeling from the War of Five Kings. We either see Tywin Lannister toppled from power, or we break the Iron Throne's hold on Westeros entirely." Doran's face remained impassive. "And the boy king, Tommen Baratheon or Joffrey's memory, whatever remains of Lannister's claims to the throne, what of that?" Oberyn's voice was steely. "I care not for who sits upon that accursed chair. Dorne has never needed the Iron Throne to rule itself. But if the Lannisters remain in power, Elaya's name will be lost to 1,000 lies. We must make certain the realm learns the truth, sees the truth, and fosters no illusions about Tywin's innocence." Doran gazed at his younger brother for a long moment. Outside, the sea breeze rattled window shutters, and the crack of distant sails could be heard. At last, Doran nodded. "We shall call the banners. Aryan, see to it that every noble house in Dorne is prepared for the possibility of war. We will attempt to build alliances, but we will not hesitate to raise our spears." Aryan's expression was resolute. She bowed her head, dark curls framing her face. "As you command, father." There was a stirring among the court. Oberyn felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by the gravity of the task ahead. They would not trust entirely in cloak and dagger strategies. Dorne would move as one. The scorpion had awakened, and the Lannisters would soon feel its sting. In the following weeks, Sunspear bustled with activity. Messengers arrived daily, some from the Reach, some from the Vale, even a few from Ironborn pirates who circled the coasts looking for advantage. Oberyn personally oversaw the training of new recruits, drilling them in the spear and shield. His daughters, the Sand Snakes, Obara, Nymeria, Tyene, Sarella, and the others, were more than eager to prove themselves. They scattered across Dorne, rallying minor lords, forging new connections, ensuring loyalty was rock solid. The world had changed the day Oberyn slew the Mountain, and House Martell was determined to shape that change to their liking. Oberyn did not neglect the game of alliances. He penned letters to Mace Tyrell in Highgarden, addressing the man's well-known ambition. The letter hinted at a future in which the Tyrells might free themselves from Lannister shadow. He also reached out to newly emergent powers, uncertain though they were, some northern bannermen who followed the Stark cause, pockets of resistance in the Riverlands to the Frey Dominion. He even dared send a missive to Riverrun, where rumors said the Blackfish held out. Each letter carefully danced between offering Dorne's support and challenging the Lannisters' legitimacy. A web was forming, though how strong it would be remained unclear. Among those to respond earliest was Margaery Tyrell, speaking through a letter that arrived in the hand of her lady-in-waiting. Margaery's tone was careful, couched in courtesy, but it acknowledged the Lannisters' precarious position. A secret message, tucked beneath the formal letter, revealed that Mace Tyrell found the rumors of Tywin's guilt disconcerting. He was no fan of open war, but if forced to choose sides, House Tyrell might side with whoever promised them the largest share of influence in King's Landing. Reading that letter in his solar, Oberyn tapped a finger against his chin. Illyria read over his shoulder. "They will join whoever they believe is strongest," she said. "Not the most righteous, but the most likely to win." Oberyn smiled grimly. "And so we must show them strength." He penned a response, carefully flattering Margaery's intelligence and Mace's standing, hinting that a victory over the Lannisters would leave the Tyrells poised to shape the future of the Iron Throne. He never promised them the throne itself, but he suggested that Dorne would not oppose a Tyrell or Tyrell-aligned monarch, provided justice was served upon Tywin Lannister and his co-conspirators. While these missives flew about the realm, Oberyn resumed the more personal side of the conflict, investigating the truth behind Elaya's murder. He had not forgotten that moment in the Red Keep when Gregor gasped Tywin's name. Oberyn knew Ser Amory Lorch and other soldiers were also part of the atrocity at the sack of King's Landing. Now, after all these years, gathering evidence was challenging. But Oberyn did not relent. He used gold, intimidation, and wit to draw out confessions. The older knights who served Tywin in that era were well aware of the danger in speaking. Some refused. Others vanished before they could be interrogated. Still, piece by piece, Oberyn uncovered a tapestry of complicity that tied Tywin to the brutal murder of Elia and her children. Each day that dawned found Oberyn more determined. He was done waiting for the Lannisters to hold all the cards. Dorne's armies were forming. Even the ships of the southern coast were being fitted for war, though Dorne had never been known as a great naval power. Word came that the Lannisters were calling their own banners. The realm teetered on the brink of open conflict. Tywin had thus far avoided direct confrontation. But with each rumor that claimed the Red Viper had proof of Tywin's guilt, the tension ratcheted higher. Jaime Lannister, as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, would remain in King's Landing. Cersei, too, sharpened her figurative claws in her role as Queen Mother. And Tyrion? Some said he might depart the city for Casterly Rock or hide in the shadows of the capital. Oberyn hoped Tyrion would find his way to safety, for the dwarf was one Lannister he could tolerate, perhaps even respect. In the midst of these preparations, Arianne Martell approached Oberyn with a question that weighed heavily on her mind. They stood upon a balcony overlooking the sea, the wind snapping at the banners of House Martell. Arianne's gaze was solemn. "Uncle, even if we defeat the Lannisters, what then? We place someone else on the throne, but Dorne remains a vassal of the Iron Throne. Elaya's murder may be avenged, yet will we return to the status quo, with some new king or queen lording over the Seven Kingdoms?" Oberyn considered her words, the gulls crying overhead. "Times are shifting," he said. "If we achieve our vengeance, we could push for a freer Dorne, perhaps even independence. You know our history. Dorne joined the Targaryen realm through marriage and diplomacy, not conquest. We are not as deeply chained as the rest. If the realm fractures, if the North remains in rebellion, if the Riverlands are in disarray, if the Iron Islands seize independence, who is to say Dorne cannot forge its own path?" Arianne's eyes flickered with excitement. "A free Dorne, perhaps," Oberyn mused. "But for now, let us focus on toppling Tywin's hold. That is step one." Then came the day the raven arrived with a black wax seal. It bore the imprint of a lion, but hammered around it was a sign that suggested urgency. The messenger brought it straight to Doran. Oberyn and Illyria were summoned to Doran's Solar, where the prince read the letter in silence. His expression was grave. "Tywin Lannister demands our presence in King's Landing for a royal hearing regarding Gregor Clegane's final words," Doran said slowly, skimming the text. "He offers safe passage, claims he only wants to clarify the circumstances of Elaya's death to preserve House Martell's honor." Doran's lip curled. "He insists that we have misinterpreted the words of a dying man." Oberyn laughed, cold and mirthless. "He wants me to walk into his lion's den so he can attempt to discredit me. Likely he hopes to kill me quietly if he can." Doran tapped a finger against the table. "He threatens the possibility of war if we fail to comply. Yet war is what we are preparing for anyway, if needed." "Yes, but we are not fully ready," Arianne pointed out, having entered behind Oberyn. "I doubt Tywin is ready either, but the Lannisters have more gold and alliances in the capital." Illyria shook her head. "He wants to lure us away from Dorne so that we cannot direct our forces. If you go, Oberyn, you risk everything." Oberyn felt a surge of feral determination. "I will not crawl to Tywin's court. We have the upper hand in the realm of public opinion. That is why he's trying to twist the narrative." Doran handed the letter to Oberyn. The lines of his face were etched with worry. "If we do nothing, Tywin will spin our refusal as proof of falsehood. Yet if we accept, we risk walking into a trap." A hush settled. Oberyn's thoughts raced. Then a slow grin curved his mouth. Let Tywin gather his lords and ladies. Let him posture and proclaim his innocence. The more he denies, the more suspicious he appears. Meanwhile, we rally our allies. We do not go to King's Landing. We invite the lords of the realm to Dorne for a council. A show of good faith, we have nothing to hide. If Tywin is so confident in his innocence, let him come here, away from his base of power. Arianne's brows arched, and Ilaria smiled at the audacity of it. Dorne let out a slight laugh. You propose the lion step into the viper's nest. Bold. Indeed, Oberyn replied. He will refuse, of course, which will only inflame suspicion. Meanwhile, we stoke the fires of doubt across Westeros. Eventually, Tywin will be forced to either bend or break. And if he chooses the latter, we meet him on the field. Dorne exhaled, the faintest sign of relief at his brother's cunning plan. So be it. I will draft a reply. Thus began a series of letters that flew back and forth between Sunspear and the Red Keep. Tywin raged at Dorne's insolence, but could not openly declare war without further undermining the legitimacy of his grandson's throne. Whispers sprang up in the Reach and the Stormlands that Dorne held irrefutable proof of Tywin's guilt, that Prince Oberyn had discovered hidden testimonies from the sack of King's Landing. In taverns from Old Town to the Fingers, people repeated the tale of Gregor's dying confession. Tywin Lannister gave the order. Some believed it wholeheartedly. Others claimed the Martells were forging lies to weaken the Lannisters. Still, the rumor spread, unstoppable. And then, in a stroke of fate, another piece of the puzzle arrived at Dorne's doorstep. A weary hedge knight, wounded and half-starved, sought an audience with Oberyn. He carried an old letter bearing the seal of Rhaegar Targaryen. This knight, who once served among the Targaryen loyalists, claimed to have direct knowledge of Tywin's complicity. Oberyn was initially skeptical, suspecting a trick or a forgery. But upon examining the letter and cross-referencing the stories, it became clear the man had been near the city when it fell. He had once rescued documents from the flames, including communications between Rhaegar and his father, King Aerys. Some had to do with Elia Martell's protection in the final days, referencing that Tywin was kept outside the gates intentionally, suspecting betrayal. Those documents, if authentic, were a goldmine. They showed that Elia was explicitly placed under the crown's protection, that Tywin was not to be trusted. They were not a direct order to kill her, but they painted Tywin as the opportunistic turncloak who sacked the city. Coupled with Gregor's confession, it was damning. Oberyn's hands shook as he read. Elia had been deliberately left vulnerable when the king refused Tywin entry initially. Once the gates were opened, Tywin's men flooded in and performed the atrocities. She was never meant to be a casualty, the letter insisted. We trust Lord Tywin will see reason. A bitter taste filled Oberyn's mouth. Reason was never Tywin's intent. He wanted to present the city as a gift to Robert Baratheon, coated in Targaryen blood. With this new evidence in hand, Oberyn redoubled efforts to secure alliances. If war came, they would not fight alone. Word was that the Tyrells were on the fence, but receptive. The north was fractured, but some bannermen might join a southern force to oust the Lannisters, avenging the Red Wedding that had decimated the Starks. The River Lords under siege by the Freys might also side with anyone who promised them relief. Only the Westerlands and the Crown's loyal bannermen remained firmly in Tywin's camp, along with the remains of the Crownlands. Then the first blow fell. A raven arrived from a lesser Dornish outpost near the Prince's Pass. Lannister outriders had been spotted. Small but deadly groups, accompanied by mercenaries, were harrying villages, testing the border. Oberyn recognized it for what it was. A provocation, a warning. Tywin was sending men to gauge Dorne's readiness for battle and to strike fear into the smallfolk. He wanted Dorne's populace cowed. Oberyn's response was immediate. He dispatched a cadre of Dornish spearmen, led by Obara Sand, to drive these interlopers back. By the next fortnight, word came that the Lannister outriders had been destroyed. The border was secure, but the act signaled the start of open conflict. There would be no turning back now. War's first spark had ignited. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister fumed. She pressed her father to send a larger force, to punish Dorne for their insolence, to crush the Red Viper. Tywin, though furious, tried to remain measured. He had the crown to consider, the boy King Tommen to maintain as a symbol of Lannister Baratheon rule, and a capital still recovering from the War of Five Kings. But the more the rumors spread of his guilt, the less stable his grip on power became. He had never been one to shy from war, but this was a precarious moment, requiring not just force but cunning. Yet Oberyn and Dorne had cunning of their own, and they were no longer fighting alone. By the time the harvest season approached, Dorne's armies had arrayed at the northern passes. 40,000 spears, bolstered by cavalry and archers, with more levies on standby. The Dornish navy, modest though it was, kept watch along the coast. Meanwhile, the Tyrells began to mass forces near the Mander, though they claimed publicly it was for defense. Some Stormlords, particularly those loyal to the deceased Stannis Baratheon, muttered about joining Dorne if it meant overthrowing the Lannisters. The chaos swirling around Westeros made alliances shift like dunes in the wind, but each day that passed saw Oberyn's cause gain traction. It was then that a delegation arrived from King's Landing under the banner of peace, though no one in Dorne believed it truly was. Ser Kevan Lannister led the delegation, accompanied by several knights and a small retinue. He asked for an audience with Prince Doran, stating that Tywin wished to negotiate a settlement to avert unnecessary bloodshed. The day Kevan arrived in Sunspear, the sun beat down mercilessly. He was escorted into the Hall of Pillars, where Doran sat in state, Oberyn at his side. Banners of House Martell draped the columns. Dornish soldiers, armed and stern, lined the walls. Kevan Lannister, older and more careful than Tywin, bowed stiffly. The dryness in the air made him sweat through his fine garments. Doran inclined his head, offering minimal hospitality. Ser Kevan, I trust your journey was uneventful. Kevan forced a thin smile. Indeed, we appreciate the courtesy of safe passage. Oberyn watched with narrowed eyes. Kevan was known to be pragmatic. If he was here, Tywin might be looking to gauge Dorne's resolve or sow doubt. Kevan cleared his throat, voice echoing in the hall. Lord Tywin wishes to avoid a realm-wide conflict. He believes the matter of Prince Oberyn's claims regarding the late Ser Gregor Clegane's final words can be resolved without resorting to bloodshed. He offers a series of concessions, trade agreements with Sunspear, pardons for any Dornishman who might have acted against the crown, and even a formal apology for the tragedies that befell Princess Elia during the sack of King's Landing, albeit with no admission of guilt on Lord Tywin's part. A murmur ran through the hall. Oberyn's jaw clenched. An apology without guilt? What a farce. He could barely contain his anger. Doran maintained composure, though the tension in his posture betrayed how he felt. That is all he offers? Kevan gave a short nod. House Lannister is prepared to be quite generous in other matters as well. Marriage alliances, shipments of grain, gold to ease any hardships in Dorne. But in exchange, we ask that Prince Oberyn and House Martell publicly retract accusations against Lord Tywin, acknowledging that Ser Gregor's last words were not a clear confession. We want peace, Your Highness. Silence fell. The temperature seemed to spike even hotter. Finally, Oberyn spoke, his voice laced with contempt. Ser Kevan, your brother can keep his gold and groveling. I want justice, not hush money. I have living witnesses, letters, confessions, all pointing to Tywin's hand in my sister's murder. And he dares to ask me to retract the truth. Kevan bristled, but he controlled his tone. My lord, with all due respect, much of this so-called proof remains uncorroborated. The realm needs stability, not further destruction. The War of Five Kings has only just subsided. Doran's gaze was heavy with sadness and resolve. Indeed, the realm does need stability. Yet how can there be stability if a great house commits atrocities and never answers for them? I have lost enough family to Lannister ambitions. He looked to Oberyn. My brother is not the only one who burns for justice. All Dorne does. Kevan swallowed hard. He understood the futility of this mission. Still, he managed a final attempt. "Prince Doran, I urge you to reconsider. House Lannister does not wish another war, but if pressed, we will respond. Our resources remain considerable. You must know that this path leads to rivers of blood." A hush. Oberyn broke it with a voice that cut like a blade. "Better rivers of blood than another generation living under the lie that Elia Martell was just a casualty of war. We will not bow to Tywin. My spear tasted Lannister flesh once. It will not shy from it again if forced." The hall seemed to shudder with the weight of his words. Kevan Lannister saw the determination in the gathered Dornishmen, the same steely resolve in their eyes that mirrored Oberyn's. With a tired nod, Kevan said only, "Then I see there is no accord to be reached," and that ended the farce. After Kevan departed, the tensions between Dorne and the Iron Throne burst fully into the open. Tywin commanded the royal armies to assemble in the Crownlands, calling upon the Westerlands to march. The Crown's official stance labeled Dorne as aggressors, citing Oberyn's falsely obtained confessions. Meanwhile, Dorne declared they sought justice for murder perpetrated by the hand of the king himself. The first major clash occurred at the borders of the Stormlands, near the shores of the Sea of Dorne. The Lannisters sent a vanguard of knights and sellswords under the banner of King Tommen, claiming to defend the realm from Dornish aggression. House Martell's forces, guided by Oberyn's cunning tactics, ambushed them in a rocky pass. The battle was short but brutal. Dornish spears pinned knights to the ground, while archers rained arrows from high ridges. Reports said Oberyn himself slew half a dozen men, his spear whirling in deadly arcs, lithe as a serpent among stumbling brutes. The Lannister vanguard was routed, leaving the pass littered with corpses. News of the victory spread fast, and with it, Dorne's confidence grew. Tywin's forces were not invincible, and the illusions of Lannister supremacy began to crack. Across Westeros, those discontent with Lannister rule grew bolder. Small folk whispered that the Red Viper was unstoppable, that fate itself kept him alive to exact vengeance for Elia. Those rumors, of course, were inflated by fear and imagination, but they nonetheless demoralized Tywin's supporters. War had a way of feeding on rumor as much as on steel and blood. It was then that Mace Tyrell finally declared his hand. In a lavish ceremony at Highgarden, he pronounced that House Tyrell could no longer stand by while the Lannisters dragged the realm into another conflict. He did not explicitly declare for Dorne, but he withdrew all support from the Iron Throne, citing the need to protect the Reach from war. He moved troops to defend his borders against any Lannister incursion. This effectively cut off the King's Landing supply lines from the southern breadbasket, a move that placed massive pressure on Tywin. Simultaneously, the Riverlands rose in sporadic revolt, harassing Frey and Lannister outposts. Though they had no single leader, Edmure Tully was a captive, the Blackfish rumored to be at large. Enough rebellious lords realized an opportunity to strike back. Bit by bit, Tywin's grip loosened. The Iron Throne supporters faced enemies on multiple fronts. Oberyn pressed the advantage. He led his forces through the Red Mountains and into the Stormlands, forging a loose agreement with some of the local lords. The plan was to march northward, skirting the east coast. If the Tyrells decided to push from the west or at least remain neutral, Tywin's armies could be squeezed between two powers. Meanwhile, the capital grew more vulnerable by the day. Even the Iron Bank of Bravos, hearing of the Lannisters' troubles, began to waver in its once unquestioning faith that House Lannister always paid its debts. The bank signaled it might extend credit lines to other powers, an ominous sign for Tywin. Economic cracks formed beneath the shining facade of King's Landing. Tension in the city soared. Reports of bread riots in Flea Bottom circulated. The Gold Cloaks struggled to maintain order as the cost of food rose and shipments from the Reach dwindled. Standing in a camp near the border of the Stormlands, Oberyn surveyed a map spread across a wooden table. Alleria stood on one side, Arianne on the other, while the Sand Snakes and Dornish captains ringed the area. Torchlight flickered in the gloom of approaching night. Oberyn traced a path on the map. "We can push toward Haystack Hall," he said. "If we secure it, we have a direct route toward King's Landing along the Sea Road." Tywin will have to meet us in open battle or risk the capital's isolation. A middle-aged captain nodded. Our scouts say the Lannisters have men near the Rose Road, but they're stretched thin. Many are near Blackwater Rush, expecting a Tyrell maneuver from the west. Good, Oberyn said. We will strike quickly, before they can reorganize. Arianne smiled at her uncle. And then, once we're at King's Landing's doorstep, Oberyn's eyes glittered. We force Tywin to face the justice he has evaded for years. Either he surrenders and stands trial, or the city falls to us. I have no desire to rule from the Red Keep, but I have every desire to see the Lannisters cast down. In the flicker of the torches, Oberyn's face looked almost demonic with passion. Yet behind that fierce exterior lay a devotion that had smoldered for decades. He could practically taste the vengeance he'd longed for. The next morning they struck. Dawn found Dornish outriders sweeping around Haystack Hall, cutting off messengers. Oberyn's main host approached from the south, moving in disciplined ranks. A token garrison there, loyal to the crown, fell swiftly. Oberyn spared most of the defenders who surrendered, sending them westward with a grim warning to any who would align with Tywin. The Martell banners were raised over the ramparts of Haystack Hall, a bold statement of Dorne's campaign. News of the swift conquest rippled through the Stormlands. Some lords, reluctant to join House Martell, withdrew into their castles, hoping to avoid the conflict altogether. Others, enticed by the promise of dethroning the Lannisters, welcomed Oberyn's forces. Tywin's coalition found itself unraveling. Finally, Tywin had little choice but to muster a grand army near King's Landing. Reinforcements poured in from the Westerlands, though not in the numbers they might have before the War of Five Kings. Many of the Crown's knights were war-weary and uncertain. Meanwhile, Cersei fumed and demanded more extreme measures, perhaps seeking to lure Dorne into a trap or to assassinate Oberyn. But Tywin could not easily replicate the cunning that had once brought House Rayne to heel. This was a different enemy. Dorne was not a single castle to be besieged. It was an entire region, brimming with people who had nursed a grudge for nearly 2 decades. As Oberyn's army moved closer to the capital, they clashed with several detachments of Lannister and Crown forces. Some fights were small skirmishes with minimal losses. In at least one major engagement near the Wendwater, thousands of men collided. The mud churned red with blood, and the clang of steel on steel rose above the roaring water. Oberyn led from the front, carving through lines of enemy infantry. The Sand Snakes distinguished themselves, each daughter lethal in her chosen style. When dust settled, the Dornish had the upper hand. The King's Landing defenders retreated in disarray, leaving behind wagons of supplies. In the after-battle hush, Oberyn gazed across the carnage. Bodies lay broken in the mud. The stench of death pricked at his nostrils. He felt no triumph in the slaughter. He wanted Tywin's head, not the lives of ordinary soldiers. But war did not yield to such niceties, so he gritted his teeth and pressed on. King's Landing loomed on the horizon. The city's walls stood as a final barrier between Oberyn and the man he despised. Within those walls, rumor said Tywin had grown increasingly desperate, though he tried to project an aura of control. The Tyrells had not openly marched on the city but had effectively blockaded shipments from the Reach. Food was scarce. The small folk seethed. Tensions rose daily. Oberyn established a camp just south of the city, near a bend in the Blackwater Rush, out of range of the city's scorpions and archers. Scouts reported that Tywin's main force held the northern approach, stationed outside the walls to prevent a siege from that direction. The lines of tents and banners told Oberyn that Tywin's host was still formidable. Thousands of knights, men-at-arms, and siege engines. That night, Oberyn walked the perimeter of the Dornish camp, a cloak wrapped around his shoulders against the chill wind sweeping off the river. He felt Illyria's presence at his side, silent and comforting. The watchfires glowed like embers in the dark. Troops huddled around them, sharpening weapons, telling quiet tales. Overhead, the stars shone, indifferent to the toils of men. Illyria finally broke the silence. "We are here," she said softly. At the very threshold, Elaya's memory is as close to vindication as it has ever been. Oberyn inclined his head. I know, yet it feels heavy. I want Tywin's downfall, but I also want an end to the bloodshed. I do not relish the destruction war brings. Elaria touched his arm. Your anger has guided you this far, but you have always tempered it with a sense of justice. That is why people follow you. He gave a humorless chuckle. Perhaps, or they see a chance to topple the Lannisters and carve out a better future. Either way, I must see this through. She nodded. And I will stand beside you. At dawn, the final confrontation took shape. Tywin deployed his army outside the city gates, near the ruins of some outlying farms. The ground was relatively open, albeit dotted with patches of brush. On the far side, Oberyn arrayed his Dornishmen. Banners emblazoned with the sun and spear rippled in the breeze. The tension was palpable. Dust kicked up underfoot as lines of cavalry moved into position. Archers notched arrows, waiting for the command. Squires hurried with last-minute tasks, eyes wide with fear. Oberyn rode down the front line on a sleek Dornish mare, meeting the gazes of his men. His spear was strapped across his back, a curved sword at his hip. He wore light armor suited to speed and agility. Overhead, the sky was a pale blue, as if nature itself were holding its breath. From the opposite side, Tywin Lannister's bannermen bristled with steel. In the center, the golden lion of House Lannister was displayed proudly. Even from a distance, Oberyn recognized the imposing figure on a magnificent warhorse. Tywin himself, clad in gilded armor, face like chiseled stone. A rider approached from the Lannister side under a white banner, presumably to deliver final terms. Oberyn, with Doran's permission, rode out to meet him halfway. They halted within earshot. It was not Kevin this time, but a Lannister cousin. The man's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. Lord Tywin offers one last chance to avoid bloodshed. Renounce your accusations and disband your army, and the crown will be merciful to Dorne. Oberyn stared at the messenger, letting the silence stretch. Then he said with cold finality, Tell Lord Tywin I will see him answer for my sister's murder, or see him dead upon this field. The messenger swallowed and turned his horse back. Oberyn did the same. As he returned to the Dornish lines, he exchanged a glance with Arianne, who waited with a contingent of cavalry. She lifted her chin in readiness. The Sand Snakes, each commanding their own company, nodded in fierce determination. The horns sounded. War erupted in a thunder of hooves and a chorus of shouted commands. The Lannister line advanced at a disciplined pace, spears bristling in front of mounted knights, archers loosing volley after volley. The Dornish responded in kind. Arrows arced overhead, lodging in shields and flesh. Horses screamed. Men roared. Sunlight glinted on steel as the two armies collided in a cacophony of violence. Oberyn led a flank, his spear darting like a viper's fang. He spurred his mare through a gap, disabling a knight with a thrust to the shoulder. He spun, parried another blow, and cracked a second man's helmet with the butt of his spear. Dust and blood filled his vision. He fought with the grace and speed that had marked him a legend in the fighting pits of Essos. Around him, the Dornish advanced in coordinated waves, exploiting Lannister weaknesses, harassing their cavalry with nimble footmen. On the far flank, Oberyn Sand led a ferocious charge of lightly armored horsemen. They wheeled around the Lannister lines, cutting down archers. In the center, Tyene and Nymeria Sand coordinated spear walls that braced for the Lion's cavalry charges. The clang of metal, the screams, the pounding drums of war. It was chaos incarnate. Yet, amidst the chaos, Oberyn had one goal: to find Tywin Lannister. He pressed deeper, rallying men with a cry of "Elia!" They surged forward. Lannister foot soldiers fell back, or died where they stood. The ground turned slick with blood. Oberyn's spear dripped red, his face splattered with gore, but his eyes burned with unwavering focus. Then he saw the gilded armor, not far ahead. Tywin was astride a powerful destrier, commanding a knot of seasoned knights. The old lion still exuded authority. Men rallied around him, forming a bulwark. Oberyn spurred his mare, cutting a path through the melee. He glimpsed Tywin's gaze behind the visor. Steady, cruel, calculating. Before Oberyn could close the distance, a wave of Lannister spears thrust at him. He jerked his reins, pivoting his mare. She screamed as a spear point grazed her flank. Oberyn wheeled his weapon, knocking 2 men down, then vaulted from his saddle to avoid being unhorsed. He landed lightly, rolling to his feet. His mare galloped off, wounded but not mortally so. Now on foot, Oberyn faced a ring of enemies. His blood sang. This was what he had trained for all his life, this dance of death. He spun his spear in a lethal arc, cutting through a knight's guard. The man toppled, screaming. Another soldier lunged, and Oberyn twisted aside, plunging the spear through the man's visor slit. Again, Oberyn spun, searching for Tywin. In the confusion, the old lion had pulled back, reorganizing his cavalry. Nearby, Nymeria Sand saw her father on foot, a circle of Lannister soldiers pressing in. She rallied a squad of Dornish spears, cutting through to Oberyn's side. Their combined assault carved an opening in the Lannister ranks. Oberyn and Nymeria locked eyes, each breathing heavily, but there was no time for words. They pressed forward. Above the din, horns sounded. Oberyn recognized the call. More Dornish reinforcements sweeping in from the left. The Lannister line buckled. Tywin's knights struggled to maintain discipline. The old lion was forced closer to the chaos. Soon there would be no escape. At last, Oberyn caught sight of Tywin again, near a battered war cart. Their gazes locked, 2 mortal enemies across a battlefield of corpses. Oberyn's heart slammed in his chest. He advanced, weaving through the press of men. Tywin's mount snorted, hooves stamping the ground. A few knights moved to guard him, but Oberyn's spear flickered out, dispatching a hapless guard. Another lunged, and Oberyn slid behind him, driving his spear into the chink of armor. Blood sprayed. Tywin dismounted, relinquishing his horse to avoid being thrown amidst the chaos. In his gauntlet hand was a long sword, gilded and carved with lions. His face beneath the visor was taut. Oberyn closed in, weapon at the ready. The swirl of bodies gave them only a small ring in which to maneuver. Their men fought all around, but this moment felt like it existed in a bubble of its own. The wind carried the stench of death. Oberyn's hair clung to his forehead, damp with sweat and blood. Tywin's lip curled in disdain. "You think you will triumph here, Viper?" he said, voice low. "This is bigger than you, bigger than your petty thirst for revenge." Oberyn leveled his spear. "It's not petty. It's for Elia, for her children, for all the families who suffered at your hands. Lannister, you have played your games long enough." They closed. Tywin might have been older, but he was no feeble man. He swung the long sword with precision, forcing Oberyn back. Oberyn ducked, parried with his spear's haft. Sparks flew. Tywin advanced relentlessly, his armor offering strong protection, whereas Oberyn wore lighter gear. But Oberyn had speed. He darted to the side, jabbing at Tywin's flank. The old lion blocked, but the impact reverberated through his armor. Oberyn grinned, pressing the attack. The clash was vicious. Oberyn landed a grazing blow on Tywin's pauldron, denting it. Tywin retaliated with a slice that nearly caught Oberyn's arm. Oberyn retreated, spinning the spear around to feint high, then thrust low. Tywin sidestepped, sword lashing out. Metal rang on metal. Both men panted, eyes locked. Tywin's face glistened with sweat, straining with each motion. Nearby, men fought and died, but Oberyn saw only Tywin. The memory of Elia's broken body, of her children dashed against a wall, filled his mind. Rage fueled him. He launched a furious series of thrusts, each aiming for a gap in Tywin's armor. Tywin parried desperately, but one blow slipped past, scraping across his breastplate. Tywin hissed, staggering back. Oberyn advanced. "Confess!" he snarled, echoing the words he had hurled at the mountain. "You gave the order. You butchered my sister." Tywin's lips curved in a sneer. "I did what was necessary for the realm. Elia was collateral in a war that your Targaryen friends were losing. You think you are so righteous? You are just another pretender, bathing in blood." Oberyn's fury peaked. He lunged, ignoring the risk, driving his spear at Tywin's heart. Tywin caught the haft with his gauntlet hand, twisting it aside, and slashed with his sword. The blade scraped Oberyn's side, drawing blood. A fiery pain flared, but Oberyn gritted his teeth, pivoted, and slammed the spears but into Tywin's helmet. The lion stumbled, dropping to one knee. Oberyn swept in, hooking the blade of his spear behind Tywin's sword arm, forcing it down. He pressed the spear point to the gap in Tywin's gorget, just below the jaw. Tywin's breath rattled, eyes wide. The battlefield noise receded into a distant roar. Soldiers parted, giving the two men space. Oberyn's chest rose and fell in ragged heaves, blood soaking his tunic. Tywin kneeled, cornered by the spear that quivered against his throat. "Confess?" Oberyn repeated, voice shaking with both rage and triumph. "Say Elia's name, acknowledge what you did to her, or die without the chance to speak." Tywin's eyes flickered with defiance and fear. The proudest man in Westeros was at the mercy of the man he had underestimated. He opened his mouth, perhaps to curse or to lie, but then he saw the unwavering glare in Oberyn's eyes, the condemnation. A hush blanketed the immediate area. Across the battlefield, fighting waned as word spread that Tywin Lannister had fallen. Oberyn pressed the spear in a fraction deeper, drawing a bead of blood. "Say it." At last, Tywin's voice emerged, a bitter growl. "Elia Martell was ordered to be killed, yes, by me." He spat blood, or maybe it was just phlegm from the dust of battle. "Are you satisfied, Viper?" A tremor rippled through Oberyn, the final admission of guilt. He thought of every tear shed in Dorne, every year of seething hatred. The tension in his arms wavered, as if uncertain whether to plunge the spear in or to let Tywin speak more. Then Tywin's mouth curled in a final sneer. "Elia was a piece in a grand game. You have upended the realm for her. I hope you find the piece that eluded her." A wave of red rage flooded Oberyn's vision. With a swift motion, he drove the spear forward, piercing Tywin's throat. The old lion's eyes went wide. Blood bubbled from his lips. The once mighty lord of Casterly Rock crumpled, dropping to the churned earth. Silence stretched out, broken only by the labored breathing of those around. Tywin Lannister's lifeblood seeped into the mud, his gaudy armor spattered with gore. Oberyn sank to one knee, pressing a hand to his own wound. He stared at Tywin's lifeless form, heart pounding like a war drum. For a long moment no one spoke. Then a shout rose among the Dornish ranks. "Justice for Elia!" Others took it up, a roar of triumph and release. The Lannister army, upon seeing their leader slain and hearing the cry, began to crumble. Some knights threw down their arms. Others fled toward the city gates. The city defenders, seeing the chaos, feared a sack and refused entry to many retreating Lannister men. Panic erupted. Oberyn struggled to stand, aided by Nymeria sand. Blood flowed from his side, but he clutched his spear with trembling hands. A hush of awe surrounded him. The Red Viper had triumphed a second time. First the mountain, now Tywin. The sun beamed down on the battlefield as though scorching away the last illusions of Lannister invulnerability. Word spread like wildfire. Tywin Lannister was dead, struck down by Oberyn Martell, who forced him to confess his crimes. Dorne's vengeance was complete. Elia's name would resound through the annals of history, vindicated by her brother's spear. In the aftermath, the capital trembled. Cersei tried to rally the remaining Lannister loyalists, but fatherless and beleaguered, they could not stand against the tide. The gates were eventually thrown open, though the Dornish took care not to initiate a bloody sack. Instead, Prince Doran arrived in a diplomatic retinue, seeking to restore order and ensure no further atrocities took place. The small folk, half-starved and desperate, offered no resistance. Many were relieved to see an end to the tyranny of Tywin. As for Tommen Baratheon, the boy king, he was placed under protective custody, a puppet of a puppet. The realm needed stability, but now that the principal architect of Lannister power had fallen, a new order was inevitable. Oberyn, bandaged and exhausted, entered the Red Keep with Ellaria by his side. Memories of the trial by combat flooded back, the scene of Gregor's confession, the taste of near death. Now, only the echo of footsteps in deserted corridors accompanied them. The golden lions that once adorned the halls seemed hollow, powerless. The Iron Throne loomed, spiked and menacing, but overshadowed by the knowledge that its occupant had lost the bedrock of Lannister power. Some on the small council whispered that Marjorie Tyrell might marry the boy king and act as queen regent, forging a Tyrell-dominated future. Others mused that the throne should go to someone who could truly unite the realm, perhaps a Targaryen rumored to be alive across the narrow sea. Dorne would weigh its role carefully. As dawn broke over King's Landing the next day, Oberyn stood atop the ramparts, gazing across the city's rooftops. Smoke rose from the outskirts where fighting had raged. The stench of ash and offal clung to the air. Part of him felt hollow. Tywin was dead. I was avenged. But what now? Could the realm truly find peace after so much strife? He felt Ellaria's hand slip into his. She rested her head on his shoulder. "It is done," she said softly. He confessed. "The truth is known." Oberyn nodded, eyes distant. "I only hope it was worth the blood spilled." They watched the sunrise together, gold and pink light spreading across a broken city. Dorne had shattered the hold of House Lannister. The old lion was gone, and with him, the illusions that had long bound the Seven Kingdoms in fear. Perhaps a new dawn would rise, shaped not by vengeance, but by the memory of what vengeance had wrought. Yet in that moment, as the sun crept higher, Oberyn allowed himself a small measure of peace. Elaya's name would no longer be drowned by lies. Dorne had answered the call, and though the cost had been great, the Red Viper had survived to see the downfall of the man responsible for his sister's tragedy. In the swirl of a realm forever changed, Oberyn Martell stood ready to guide Dorne's future. No longer content to remain in the shadows of the South, but a power with its own destiny, forged in sun-scorched sands and tempered by the fiery brand of justice. The city stirred below, uncertain but awakening, and Oberyn whispered under his breath, "Elia, you are avenged." It was not an end, but a beginning. A new chapter in the story of Dorne and Westeros, written in sun and spear, sealed in the lifeblood of a fallen lion. And as the day came into full light, the dawn found Oberyn Martell standing tall upon the ramparts. His dark eyes turned toward the horizon, where a future unbound by fear at last beckoned.